Good morning. Islam, not a small topic, nor a topic I can approach in real depth. I don't have the background to do so. But I think I can bring some information and maybe find some context for us to use in thinking of Islam in our world as a religion, a culture, and a political force. This theme was selected by Fran Soa, who purchased the sermon topic in our annual talent auction. I understand she was motivated to ask about Islam because of personal contact with a person who had been raised in the Islamic faith. And Fran realized that she wanted to know more about what that means and wanted us to know more about what that means. Islam's a big deal. There are over 2 billion Muslims in our world, a quarter of the global population. They're second in count only to Christians. We tend to think of the Middle East as the hotbed of Islam. After all, Islam began in Arabia, but most of the world's Muslims live elsewhere. Indonesia has the largest population of Muslims, followed by Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Nigeria. Each of these countries has over 100 million Muslims. Islam continues to grow, and it's likely that there will be more Muslims than Christians in this world within a generation. And although low by worldwide numbers, there are somewhere around 4 million Muslims in the United States. Illinois is 2 to 3% Islamic, with maybe as many as 500,000 Muslims. American Muslims are very diverse, as are Muslims worldwide. About half of the adults here are immigrants, and racially, 40% of them classify as white, 20% black, 30% Asian, and 8% Hispanic. By tradition and historically, Americans have tended to dislike and distrust Muslims more than almost any other group. In part, this is because we know so little about them. This was true for a long time. We even called the religion Mohammedanism, which would be taken as an affront by a true Muslim, because Muhammad is not the source of the religion. He was just the revealer of the prophecy. Islam worships Allah. Anti-Islamic sentiment increased markedly after the terrorist attacks on 9/11, and then throughout the American military engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then peaked even further with the anti-Islamic and anti-immigrant rhetoric of the Trump administration. More than half of all Muslim Americans are victims of some form of discrimination within each year. And this does not include the continuing and recurring experiences of distrust, of othering, of distancing that they know while living in our cities and towns. Muslims often dress differently, speak other language, eat other foods. Oh, that we could be a little less fearful of difference and more accepting of the gifts that they bring to us. To talk about Islam, I guess I have to start with Abraham, as we know him, whose covenant with God was the beginnings of Judaism, hence Christianity and Islam. When Abraham and his wife Sarah were unable to bear a child, this is after like 500 years of trying. Sarah suggested that Abraham couple with her servant Hagar, And indeed, Hagar bore a son, Ishmael, which made them all very happy until, surprise, Sarah got pregnant and also bore a son named Isaac. Soon Sarah became jealous and forced Abraham to exile Hagar and Ishmael from their home. Legend claims that they migrated to Mecca and that Ishmael is the progenitor of all Arabian tribes, those peoples who first adopted Islam. Sarah's kid, Isaac, was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the Muslims and Jews claim a common heritage through Abraham, who is known as Ibrahim in Arabic. They also shared the monotheistic belief in one God, and that is the major change they both brought to the region. Let's move forward from whenever Abraham lived until the 7th century of the Common Era, and a merchant named Muhammad who lived in Mecca. Muhammad was a good man, spiritual and devout, and often spent time alone in a cave pursuing personal meditation. One day, it was about the year 610, the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad and summoned him into prophethood. Thus began a 20-year process during which Allah revealed the verses known as surahs of the Quran to Muhammad. Quran, which only means recitation in Arabic, is held by Muslims to be the sacred teachings of Allah and passed through the Prophet Muhammad. It was memorized and passed on verbally, and to this date, many Islamic youth memorize either parts or the entire text in Arabic. The Quran is allegedly only sacred in Arabic, and they do this whether they speak Arabic or not. Recitation of these verses is engaging the voice of God. It is prayer. It is a sacred act in Islam. I'll skip most of the bio, but Muhammad gained followers. He fought off oppressors of his new peoples and eventually formed a strong and viable society based on this new religion. And indeed it was strong. Within a century, Islam had spread to the Atlantic Ocean across northern Africa and almost as far as China in the other direction. And eventually Islam moved as far as into Moorish Spain, where during the, I don't have my years right, but somewhere in the year like, I don't know, 1300, Moorish Spain was occupied, and Christians and Jews and Muslims coexisted fairly happily. And the cultural advances and the scientific knowledge that was brought by the Muslims far surpassed anything else that was seen in medieval Europe. People thinking about things like public sanitation and safety would come down from London and Paris to look at cities like Granada and Cordoba and marvel at what they had done. While then they would go home and walk in mud. Cordoba and Granada had sewer systems. Anyhow, I digress. Islam does hold the teachings of Judaism and Christianity also as sacred, and honors Moses and Abraham and Jesus and many others as true prophets that brought God's truth, at least the truth that was right for their time and their people. But the revelations brought to Muhammad are considered perfect, and he is the final prophet in the long line of prophets. Thus, the teachings of the Quran fully supersede those from the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament at any times when they disagree. Islam does privilege Jews and Christians over other groups because they also have revealed scripture. They are people of the book, as it is known. But Islam knows that it improves over the flaws of its predecessor religions. Now, the Quran, the centerpiece of Islamic devotion, it's an odd book by our standards. Except for Surah number 1, which is indeed introductory, the surahs are presented in order from the longest to the shortest. They're not ordered by the date in which they were recited, or they're not structured by content. It also contains very little history or storytelling like we're familiar with in the Bible. It's much more a guide to living well and to pleasing and praising Allah. And the name Islam, within that name, is embedded the fundamental teaching of the faith. Islam means both submission, surrender, and peace. It comes from the same root as shalom in Hebrew. Islam asks the devout to fully submit their attention and devotion to Allah, and through religious practice to touch and know the holy, to find peace in this world and the next. Briefly, from the first surah, the section called the Fatiha, the opening. In the name of God, the merciful Lord of mercy, praise be to God, the Lord of all being. The merciful Lord of mercy, master of the day of judgment. You alone we serve, and you alone we come for aid. God, guide us in the straight path, the path of those whom you have blessed, not of those against whom there is displeasure, nor of those who have gone astray. That is the opening of the Quran. We'll hear a little bit more in a moment. I once tried to read the Quran without direction, without much knowledge of Islam, and I was immediately turned off. It felt cloying because every surah started with praise language, and it made no sense to me. It had no through line, no story, no plot. Now I understand more about it, and I think I need to try again, realizing a lot more about its form and its purpose. And we commonly hear Quranic teachings that are very strict, patriarchal, vengeful, and violent. At least we hear that in our world. And those are just a few of the negative traits in the common Western narrative of Islam. Americans key in on Sharia, Islamic law, jihad, I don't know how to say it, the holy war against infidels, and the repression of women, among other things. And each of these prevails somewhat in some Islamic societies. But they only take on serious negative consequences, in my eyes, within groups that are very traditional and hold very traditional cultural norms and values and adapt Islam to their thinking. Just as we might see with some conservative or fundamentalist groups in Orthodox Judaism or in Christianity, it's possible to bring the repressive out of literal readings of the Quran. After all, it is considered perfect, and if you can find it, it must be true. Being composed during a time when Arabia was a tribal order, many instructions of the Quran do feel retrograde and overly traditional to our modern ear. We can't, for example, condone cutting off the hands of a thief or stoning the adulterer to death. Truth is, neither do most Muslim nations today either. The same for female circumcision and other horrors we hear discussed. These actions are typically held to be illegal. The Quran is now understood to require interpretation and adjustment to the times. This is not easy for Islamic clerics, but the accommodation of Islamic teaching is routine in modern Islam. There were many conflicts when traditional Islam ran into Western modernity, but over time, they have learned that they want themselves and their followers to accept the modern part of modernity, but to be less enthusiastic about taking on the Western part of Western modernity. Western culture is it's active and stimulating and consumer-oriented and thrill-seeking, at least what we see in the media, and these are not conducive to what we would think of when we dedicate our lives to submission to Allah. Let me back up and read a few real Quranic passages on female attire from somewhere in Surah 10. There's a section on modesty in women. Enjoin believing women to turn their eyes away from temptation and to preserve their chastity, to cover their adornments, except such as are normally displayed, to draw their veils over their bosoms and not to reveal their finery except to members of the household. And let them not stamp their feet when walking so as to reveal their hidden trinkets. It goes on, but this is as explicit as the Quran gets about women or what women are supposed to wear. Everything we know about hijabs and burqas and other such things, and whether one does or does not have to wear them, is a local interpretation and adaptation of the words that we just heard. On women's rights, as much as we think the Quran might be traditionalistic, paternalistic, and conservative regarding women, which it is, at the time it actually brought a number of liberating rights to women. It made female infanticide illegal. It provided women with some rights towards divorce, and it required that they be given some inheritance for the first time. I think I'll skip the reading, but that's sort of what was in this section. And on jihad, the call to holy war. I have to follow my own notes. In this crazy book, which isn't even the Quran, it's got sections of the Quran in it. Fight for the sake of God those that fight against you, but do not attack them first. God does not love the aggressor. Permission to take up arms is hereby given to those who are attacked because they have been wronged. Fighting is obligatory for you, much as you dislike it, but you may hate a thing although it is good for you, and love a thing although it is bad for you. God knows, but you do not. Anyhow, again, so the section on jihad does not say kill the infidel. It says defend yourself. These are not what we might have expected, given what we hear about the Quran. There's no question that the spin that we've heard on Muslim teaching is not fair. Imagine if we pulled only the most violent and repressive words from the Christian Bible, and then we might realize how unfair some of these criticisms are when we reflect about how they apply in our world today. That said, many Muslim societies do pursue traditional and fundamental points of view and impose some backward cultural beliefs on these Islamic teachings. The Taliban and the Saudi ruling family provide pretty good examples of this. Back to practice, though, as complex as it might be, Islam is really extremely simple in its big rules, the things you have to do. A Muslim must practice 5 pillars of the faith, the 5 required actions that Allah asks of a believer. The first is declaration of the Shahada, or testimony, which is the only action you need to do to become Islamic, to become a Muslim. The Shahada is simple. There is no God but God. Muhammad is his messenger. I have to say this in Arabic, but that's it. If you say those words, you can become Muslim. You don't sign a book. Go to catechism class or whatever, those CCD things or whatever else there are. You just say it. The second is familiar to us, is prayer. Traditionally at 5 times during the day. Find a peaceful spot, prostrate yourself, and pray. The prayer can go many places, but it always starts pretty much the same way. Allahu Akbar, God is most great. You say that 4 times. I testify that there is no God but God. I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Hurry to prayer, hurry to betterment. God is most great. I testify that there is no God but God. These words said by billions of people 5 times a day, it's to create a broad community of believers. Zakat, giving alms or charity, is the third obligation. Typically, a good Muslim will give a percentage of their wealth annually to a charitable order, and there are many groups organized just for this purpose. And if you're an affluent person, a percentage of your wealth is much more than a percentage of your income. Many Muslim countries don't even really have a social support system in their governments because they count on the zakat groups to do so. I was telling Fran that just the other day I heard a commercial on the radio asking for volunteers to drive zakat meals to Muslim families in Chicago during Ramadan. Which brings us to Psalm or fasting, which is the 4th pillar. Muslims fast during the month of Ramadan, the 9th month of their calendar year. During Ramadan, which celebrates the first month of Revelation in the cave in Mecca, Muslims abstain from food, sexual relations, and other pleasures between sunrise and sunset. This year, Ramadan begins on Wednesday. So if you see a Muslim coworker start to fade at the end of the day next week, cut them some slack. The meal breaking this fast at dusk each day is usually celebratory. It's a time for the family to gather. And the celebration of Eid, and I don't know the rest of the name, at the end of Ramadan is a big, important family holiday and time of celebration. The 5th and final obligation of a Muslim is the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. It's done once during their life and involves a ritual walking around the Kaaba, a large black stone temple that is said to have been built by Ibrahim when he brought Hagar and Ishmael into exile. So the Quran is not as restrictive or as violent as we have been told. And the practices required of Muslims are very positive. Who can argue with prayers of surrender, charity, fasting, and a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. We know that this religion fits in some repressive cultures, and we know that it is rapidly spread across much of the world. What are our Muslim neighbors up to, say here in Chicago? And what should we think of them? And what do they think of us? As you might expect, there's not a simple answer. There is much diversity and debate and confusion within the Islamic community as they struggle to find their own answers. For the most part, Muslim Americans are recent immigrants, well-educated, and relatively successful at participating in the workforce. The Muslim community once tended to be fairly conservative, but over the last quarter century, they've shifted much more towards liberalism, even before Trump's xenophobic, racist rants. They are advocates of loosening immigration policy. They're opponents of the Patriot Act and the war on terror, and they tend to support social programs. And they're quite vocal in their opposition to discrimination. They find the Democratic Party agenda much closer to their beliefs these days. But even that's not without conflict. For example, the liberals they now support do not take hardline positions on some issues of real concern to Muslims, like alcohol use, gambling, prostitution, and drugs. These are things that are disfavored strongly in the Islamic community. Abortion is a really confusing issue because different Islamic groups, and the different groups is one topic I do not address today, have different understandings of when life begins. An interesting issue is homosexuality and same-sex marriage. Fairly recently, the Islamic community was categorically opposed to same-sex relations. The Quran explicitly denounces relations between two men. Muhammad evidently didn't either envision lesbianism or didn't care about it. But recently, Muslim leaders have equivocated a bit, and they show more tolerance towards homosexual relations and transgender persons than we might expect. This is a situation where the leadership is ahead of the flock often, and many traditional-minded adherents push back against them. Who's to say they might argue in church? But this is not unique to Islam. It's the difficulty of forging change in any society, in any culture. What is clear from all this is that there's room in Islam to adjust and adapt from pure Quranic teaching to find the underlying sense between the words. The reading I used at the beginning was taken from a book by Lamia H. called Hijab Butch Blues. She's a young Pakistani woman who grew up in Saudi Arabia and immigrated to the United States to attend college. She knew she was different early in adolescence, but girls attracted to girls were not an acceptable part of Saudi life. She had trouble enough there gaining acceptance as a brown Pakistani immigrant person. When she came to America, she repressed her internal differences and pursued education for a while. When her personal turmoil surfaced into her life, she found the need to pursue her lesbianism, but as a devout and committed Islamic woman. This memoir follows her journey of finding kindred souls in the corners of Islamic life, which proved, much to her surprise, to be possible. As she details her life progress, she also includes her reconsideration of many of the Quranic surahs and her reinvention of her relation to Allah through new lenses. When I first saw this book and picked it up, I sort of expected it to be an angry screed, but I instead found a tender, poignant, and deeply moving look into one woman's difficult journey to making sense of all the things she was. That she ended up being a well-adjusted, happy Islamic lesbian in New York City was a wonderful outcome and a good moral for my story. So my simple conclusion is really just that Muslims are people too. Surprise, surprise. And if we perceive things that might make them feel odd or different to us, we should remember two things. First, we can accept that there are real differences because most Muslims have backgrounds different from those we're used to, ethnically, nationally, religiously, and in lots of other ways. And second, we need to remember that other than these obvious differences, they are pretty much just like all of us. They're trying to make life work, to get along with their families, to figure out how much they want to hold on to the beliefs they were raised with, to find a niche in a society that sometimes treats them very poorly or unfairly. They are working to find balance and meaning. And Islam is a faith of peace. That is one message I can always accept. So be it.